Well, aren't we blessed this morning? Had a wonderful rain. Have a large number of people this morning. Have several visitors with us. We've been really, really blessed. And I feel particularly blessed because I heard this morning that Greg Turner was filling out your worksheets or amending your worksheets. And we have more preachers and more song leaders, and I'm going to take more breaks. And he may even have my brother Steve up here preaching if it keeps going like this. We're glad to have all of you this morning, and I hope that you are blessed by our study. I tried to look up and see when the book of James was written. Some say that it was maybe one of the older letters written in the New Testament, written somewhere around 50 years after the death of Jesus. Now, you and I are living in 2019. But I want to ask you if you feel like I feel about this material where we've been since the beginning of July. I mean, maybe a little bit before that, but all of July and all of August and now almost all of September, this little book of James, I wonder if you feel as I, that the book seems to be written for me and for right now. Now, there are, 1950 years, 1960 years, 1970 years that have elapsed between the day that it was written for those Christians back then, and yet it feels like it's written right now for me, and I guess that's part of God's plan. But I also think that just maybe Christians haven't changed much from 50 years after the death of Christ to 2019 years after the death of Christ. Could that be? Because when he was talking about having a right perspective in all of our troubles, I thought, I need that. I'm having trouble with that. And when he was talking about not just hearing this word, but actually putting it into practice, I thought, I have some trouble with that. And surely you remember those lessons on bridling the tongue or putting a tight ring on the tongue if you call yourself a Christian. Everybody's got to have that one. That's real. And if you're going to say you have faith, can you just show it by the way you're living? Can you show it by your deeds? James seems to be saying. And I kind of personalize that one too. It feels like James was written for Ken and maybe some of you for 2019, not all those years ago. Well, the interesting thing is we begin the 4th chapter of the book of James. It doesn't get any easier, and it feels like it's written for us at this very moment. Because James begins in verse 1 with a question. He says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you?" Now, don't miss the last two words, among you. He's talking about Christians. Fights and quarrels among you. So not only are they having all these other troubles, they are having trouble with fighting and quarreling. And I kind of think that people fight. You think that's right? People in general fight. Do you find it interesting that we mark our history as a nation, and I think other nations do the same thing, not so much by our achievements, not so much by who was president at a certain time, but so much more by our fights, our wars. I'm not a historian. I didn't even like those classes. But I can still remember in all those history classes that you and I had to take, even from grade school and on, I still remember the Revolutionary War. I remember reading about the War of 1812. We read about the Civil War. And World War I and World War II. In the early 50s, it was the Korean War. And in the 60s, it was the Cold War with Russia, as well as the Vietnam War. And then we have Desert Storm War, and then we have the Iraq War, and then we have the Afghanistan War. We can kind of trace our history by looking at our wars. People kind of like to fight, I think. And then you look at quarreling with neighbors. You look at quarreling and fighting within a family. Does that ever happen? Do siblings, brothers and sisters ever fight? And do parents and children ever squabble and fight? I know of two, probably a lot more, but I know of two right now, situations where the parents and the child won't speak to each other. Isn't that interesting? But he's not talking so much about that. He's talking about Christians among you. What causes the fights and what causes the quarrels? Yes, it's true. It's true. Have you ever heard of two preachers that can't get along? And they argue and they quarrel? And I'm told, though I have never been there, I'm told it's a common thing on the mission field for missionaries to not get along and they quarrel and they fight. And I know that sometimes we fight with other congregations and quarrel with them. Last Saturday, a week ago yesterday, I was in Tulsa. And there were about 135 men there from various congregations, leaders in various congregations, kind of an elders' workshop. I was one of a few speakers, but at one point during the day, for just a few minutes, they had a small panel with two elders speaking at the panel, being asked questions. One elder was from the Memorial Road Church on that street that divides Oklahoma City and Edmond, the one on the college campus. It's without doubt the largest church of Christ in Oklahoma. The other elder was from the Edmond Church, which is exactly 2 miles down the road. It too, in its own right, is extremely large. They were saying various things about various whatevers. But I think the entire crowd was astounded when they said this. They said, we as an eldership at Memorial Road in Edmond get together and have breakfast periodically. I don't know if that meant once a quarter, a couple of times a year, but they get together and have breakfast. Because we like to get to know each other, and we like to kind of find out what's going on, because we have so many people that go from Edmond to Memorial Road and back and forth, and families, some of them live, mom and dad may go over here, and children go over here, and what we learned a long time ago, that rumors that go on about each one of us are seldom based in fact. And we decided some time ago, if we'd get together and talk, we'd know those rumors aren't true. And we'd never start down that path. Isn't that interesting? And then sometimes it's not between congregations, it's within a congregation. And we quarrel and we fight. I'm told in Lubbock, Texas today, where Susan and I have lived for the past 30 years, that one congregation, one of the large congregations, is swelling in size. Two of the other large congregations in the city are kind of shrinking a little bit because they're doing something over there that they're quarreling and fighting over there, and they're having members leave and go to this other one. Happens all the time in Lubbock over the last 30 years. Christians quarrel and fight. And James asks this question, what is it that causes it? What is causing all this quarreling and fighting among you? And when he gives the answer, I want you to really pay attention to this one thought. One overriding thought for our lesson this morning. The enemy is not in the pew in front of you, or someone next to you, or someone down the street. The enemy, James is going to say, is within us. The battle is within us. We've been fighting the wrong battle most of the time, James is going to be saying. The battle is within us. So listen to what James says. James says, what causes all these fights and quarrels? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, you don't get it. So you kill, and covet. I don't know if he means literal killing, but I know that Jesus equated killing with talking badly about people and judging people and that kind of thing. You kill and you covet and you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and you fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend them on your own pleasures or your own desires. The battle is within. Don't the fights and the quarrels come from the battle of your desires? New American Standard Version says your pleasures in your own heart. So let me ask you, would it be out of line or surprise you if I said that every one of you, including Ken, was born with incredible selfishness? We were born with incredible selfishness. So that when you were born, you learned very quickly, if you were hungry and they didn't get you fed promptly, you cried and you fussed and you may even screamed until they came and fed you. And you learned that routine pretty well. And you couldn't clean yourself up. And so when you kind of made a mess of things and it was growing uncomfortable and they didn't get to you in time, you did the same routine. You cried and you fussed until they took care of you. And then you learned that if you were tired of being in that bassinet or that crib or that baby bed by yourself for so long, if you would do the same thing, they would come and get you out and they would rock you. But every parent knows that as we move through time with our children, we have to teach them to modify that behavior and to get a handle on that selfishness. As more than one psychologist has stated, we were born delinquent. And if we don't curb that, we will become a juvenile delinquent. And if we don't curb that, we'll become an adult delinquent. There's a bunch of them out there. Because within, there is this selfishness that is so great. And this jealousy. That we spent the last 2 weeks at the end of chapter 3. And he talked about the wisdom from God versus the wisdom from Satan. And the wisdom from God is peace-loving and peacemaking, and therefore it's full of mercy and it's reasonable. But the wisdom from Satan, it's selfish. It's jealous. It's envious, and it causes all kinds of confusion and disorder and evil. Do you remember all that? And now James is saying, you've got to put up a fight. When we became Christians, we were born again. But being born again by its very terminology means that we started off as baby Christians. And we brought with us all the selfishness of this world. But we need to take the selfishness of this world and push it away and submit ourselves to God. In fact, that's going to be the theme of the entire 4th chapter. If I had time in one lesson to state the whole 4th chapter, it would all speak about one thing. It's submitting yourself to God. Rather than letting the desires of this world take hold of you, so that you live the way the world lives. It's a battle that doesn't take place on the streets. It takes place in our hearts. That you and I learn to submit to God rather than following the things that we want. And it must be so bad in that day that James writes that he says, you know what? You don't even bother to ask God. Your selfishness has gotten so deep in your life, you don't even bother to ask God. And if you do ask God, you only do it to do what? Satisfy your selfish pleasure, to give what you want. And he said, you need to understand God's not going to give you anything like that. Now, that's why Paul will say that we've got to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. We've got to change the way we think. And when Paul's talking in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4 about spiritual warfare, he says we have to take every thought and bring it under control of Christ. That's the battle that's going on. And the interesting thing is the battle doesn't end. As long as you take breath on this earth, there's a battle that you and I have to fight. I don't know if I have your attention or not. And I'm watching the clock. I know that at 11:15, if I'm not finished now, you're kind of trained to, I don't want to say be like one of those little babies that scream and yell, but I can kind of see it, okay? But if I don't have your attention, I want you to look at the next phrase that James says. You adulterous people. What? Now, is that strong language? He's talking about people who quarrel and fight and who are losing the battle within and are letting selfishness reign in their life instead of submitting to God. You adulterous people. He's not talking about the marital situation. In the Old Testament, the children of Israel would become unfaithful to God and they'd break their covenants and they'd forget who God was, and God would call them adulterous nation. In the New Testament, he's talking to people of the new kingdom. And James calls the people of the new kingdom adulterous people. Because you become more of a friend of this world than you are a friend of God. And you need to understand, when you become a friend of this world, you're an enemy of God. So if you're following all the pleasures and the desires your heart wants, you're setting yourself up as an enemy with God. And finally, he says this. He says, don't you understand that God put His Spirit inside of you? Now that's a fact. We've established that by long studies here. God put His Spirit inside of every one of us. But that Spirit is intensely, James says, jealous or envious. God doesn't want to share my heart with Satan. And God does not want to take a back seat, most certainly, with Satan. God's calling us to fight. That's strange, isn't it? With how I began all this, He's calling us to fight. It's not just, though, it's not fighting my brother Steve. It's not fighting my brother Ron. It's not fighting with Gary or Greg. It's the battle within. It's the fight that I have within. I'm going to wrestle with these desires and these selfish things that are part of my life every single day. When he said, you want and you don't get, oh, it's Ken. There are a lot of things I want and I don't get. I see you get them and I guess what? I'm going to beat you up. No, that's not real. But it's kind of real because that's the way James is saying we're acting. And he's saying, you've got to fight this battle. Set aside the pleasures of this world and submit to God. Then I promise you, a whole new world opens up. A whole new world opens up for us if we fight the battle intensely, day after day after day. So the obvious question is, are you willing to fight the battle? You don't have to. You don't have to. But if you're going to try to live the way God wants you to do it, it's a never-ending battle. Every single day I have to fight. But I do it with other things. I do it with my food, by the way. You know that my body wants all the sugar it can get its hands on? You know that? I know what's wrong with me. I want sugar all the time. And right now I can't have it. It's a miserable battle. You know that one of my favorite things is bread. And they tell me that crazy bread turns to sugar. I want it all the time. It's an everyday what? But now I take that inside, and God says, now you're in the right spot to fight, Ken. It's a fight with myself. It's a fight not to let Satan get a hold of me. It's a fight to submit to God. We're called to be soldiers, to fight in that sense. Let's stand and sing.